quantum mechanics is about 1 century old. And yet, after this century, during which this theory has been used to an amazing degree of success, and during which it has been thought through by thousands of philosophers and physicists, still the theory has a bad reputation. Quantum mechanics is usually said to be a theory with paradoxes, difficulties, opacities, and so on and so on. But in fact, the problem with quantum mechanics is that people try to get a view of the world that fits with its structure. Namely, the people ask, what must be the world, what must be the nature of the world to fit with quantum mechanics, with this extraordinary mathematical formalism of quantum mechanics. But maybe this is the problem. The problem is that maybe there is no such thing as a view of the world that fits with quantum mechanics. For instance, Richard Healey, a modern philosopher of quantum mechanics, said exactly that. He said, the main barrier to understanding quantum theory is not our inability to imagine the world it describes, but the presumption that it be understood as describing the world. Maybe you just have to relax. You just have to lose the impetus to find a view of the world that fits the theory called quantum mechanics, and just work with quantum mechanics with no view of the world. This is difficult to accept, but I think Buddhism can help in this direction. It can help to relax our attempts to grasp the world. So my talk will be exactly on that, on how Buddhism can help us to understand quantum mechanics by relaxing our attempts to grasp a view of the world that fits with it. So now I wish to understand how to compare Buddhism and quantum physics. What are these two disciplines? Buddhism and quantum mechanics. They are very different. One is a contemplative discipline. One has existential aims, and the other one is a science. The other one is a science that is relying on experiments in order to build a mathematical theory. So the two things are very different, and yet to some extent they can be compared. You know that there have been a lot of attempts at finding similarities between Buddhism and quantum physics. I quote here 4 books, 4 of the main books that try to compare Buddhism and quantum mechanics. First one, maybe my favorite, is Alan Wallace's book, Choosing Reality. Another one, remarkable book, is by His Holiness the Dalai Lama, The Universe in a Single Atom. And another one is by Victor Mansfield, Tibetan Buddhism and the Modern Science. So here you have a choice of 3 books that try to compare between quantum physics and Buddhism. But the one that was really, a highlight, that was deemed to be a sort of example of how the two disciplines should be compared, is Fritjof Capra's The Tao of Physics. Okay, this last book, Capra's The Tao of Physics, was published in 1983. But then I think it is full of clever insights, but these insights are purely analogical. They try to show that the two disciplines, Buddhism and quantum physics, yield a single view of the world, that their views of the world are similar. But it's a little bit surprising when you know the difference between the two disciplines. And when you see the details of how Fritjof Capra tries to make the analogies between quantum physics and Buddhism, you see that, in fact, the analogies are very superficial. Let me give you 3 examples of these superficial analogies. The first example is a sentence quoted by Capra, a sentence that I found, in fact, in the book of Capra. He writes, in fact, just as mystics, physicists were now dealing with a non-sensory experience of reality. What does it mean? Let me see what physicists do. Physicists, use measurement instruments to explore what they call reality. In that sense, you could say that they have a non-sensory experience of reality. But it's non-sensory in the sense of non-direct sense perception, but instead mediated perception by way of measuring instruments. Instead, mystics are very different. They don't use measuring instruments. They use their own experience. They coincide with their own experience. In a certain sense, they don't use their sense organs, because what they perceive is their own experience and nothing else, not something external that impinges on the sense organs. So the meaning of non-sensory experience for physicists and for mystics is completely different. It's even completely opposite. So this analogy of Capra is completely wrong, I think. A second analogy, Capra said, the emptiness of Eastern mystics can easily be compared to the quantum field. But what emptiness? Emptiness for Buddhists is just lack of intrinsic properties, lack of own being, as Buddhists say. Instead, the emptiness of physicists is just lack of matter. It's just absence of matter. It's the vacuum, in fact. We should say vacuum rather than emptiness in this case. And we know that the vacuum of quantum field theorists is full of virtualities, potentialities. This vacuum can generate pairs of particles and antiparticles. So it's, in that case, the vacuum of physicists is a tank of possibilities. Instead, emptiness in the sense of Buddhism is just lack of own being. I'll come back to that later. But the meaning of the word emptiness in both cases is completely different. You cannot say that the emptiness of Eastern mystics is comparable to the quantum field. It's completely different. And the last sentence in which Fritjof Capra compares Buddhism and quantum physics is this one. The dance of Shiva, in fact it's not really Buddhism, but it's rather Hinduism, I would say. The dance of Shiva, namely the rhythm of creation and destruction, is the dance of subatomic matter. The is really exaggerate, Of course there is a vague analogy. Of course Shiva creates and destroys things in the world, and he creates and destroys the world as a whole. But, subatomic matter is very different. It's not a complete creation and destruction. It's just the words that are used by quantum physicists that allude to a process of creation and annihilation. But what occurs really, in this case, is excitation and disexcitation of a quantum field. And it's completely different from the creation and destruction of Shiva. So you see, these are very vague analogies. And maybe, in the slide, you can see that Fritjof Capra has set two kinds of writings. And he compares the two kinds of writing. The first kind of writing is mathematics. And the second kind of writing is Sanskrit. And he says, look, that looks similar. But in fact, the similarity is purely superficial. The only analogy is that usually we Western people understand neither mathematics nor Sanskrit. But there is no other similarity between the two things. Okay, now let's see what we are really comparing. We are not really comparing two views of the world, but when we see a little bit more deeply into what are quantum physics and Buddhism, we see that we can compare two of the most extreme criticisms of the views of the world that have been produced by the human mind. Both Buddhism and quantum physics are critical disciplines. They are disciplines that dismantle our usual views of the world rather than construct new views of the world. So with the next slide, we can see that now there is indeed a good and strong analogy between the two, between one of the most advanced philosophy of Buddhism called Madhyamaka, namely the middle way, and quantum physics, and especially the philosophy of quantum physics on the other side. For instance, if you read Nagarjuna, you see that he writes the following sentence: emptiness is the relinquishing of all views. Emptiness by itself is not a view. It's the relinquishing of all views. So what is really specific to the most advanced philosophy of Buddhism is relinquishing any attempt at building a metaphysical view of the world. In the same way, Niels Bohr, one of the main creators of quantum mechanics, finally understood that he could not frame any good picture of the so-called atomic and subatomic world. Any picture he could use was doomed to failure. So finally he said, okay, maybe this theory has no picture of the world in store. There is no way to figure out by intuition and concepts what is this world that is described by quantum mechanics. So I discard any view of the world. I discard any picture of the atomic and subatomic world. And he wrote, quantum mechanics is a mathematical symbolism intended to predict probabilistically the outcome of experiments. And that's it. Nothing more. Nothing more is required to understand quantum mechanics. No picture, no view. So it's very similar to the Madhyamaka conception of emptiness as the relinquishment of all views. Now, in order to make this idea of Nagarjuna more precise, many commentators, Buddhist commentators of the work of Nagarjuna, who was, as you know, probably a philosopher of Indian origin and Buddhist religion, who lived approximately in the 2nd century of our era. But then came many commentators, and one commentator is Tsongkhapa, a Tibetan commentator of the 15th century, approximately. So he tried to understand the meaning of emptiness, and he said that what emptiness claims is not that, nothing exists, that since we cannot have any view of the world, then the world doesn't exist. It would be absurd. It just meant Nagarjuna just meant, according to Tsongkhapa, that in fact our conceptions of things should not be conceived as a conception of what things are in the absolute, but only of what things are relative to our approach. And here you see that Tsongkhapa said that statements which appear to reject all theses, all views, are to be understood as intending a rejection of inherent existence, own being, and to claim only that things have a relative being instead of an own being. Okay, this is really similar to quantum physics once again. Namely, for instance, Heisenberg said, quantum theory doesn't afford an image of nature, but if one still sticks to this idea of an image, a picture, a view, one should say that quantum mechanics affords an image of our relationship with nature. So you see the connection. In Buddhism, no property of things is absolute but only relative, and in quantum mechanics, the views are not absolute but only relative. So here is a real analogy. Here again you see the analogy is not about views of the world, but it's about criticisms of views of the world. The analogy is not positive, it is negative.